Marcus Rodriguez had always been smaller than his peers, standing barely 5 feet 6 inches in his combat boots. At 23, he possessed the lean build of a distance runner rather than the imposing frame typically associated with elite soldiers. His quiet demeanor and bookish appearance often led people to underestimate him, a mistake that had served him well throughout his military career. Today, however, as he stepped off the transport helicopter onto the dusty tarmac of forward operating Base Thunder, he could already sense the familiar pattern beginning to unfold. The scorching Afghan sun beat down mercilessly as Marcus shouldered his pack and surveyed his new surroundings. The base buzzed with activity, soldiers moving with practiced efficiency between concrete barriers and temporary structures. The smell of diesel fuel and dust filled his nostrils, a scent he'd grown accustomed to during his previous deployments. But this assignment was different. He wasn't here as part of a regular unit. He was here as part of an experimental program, a lone operator tasked with demonstrating new tactical approaches to asymmetric warfare. Captain Bradley Thompson was the first to approach him, a towering figure at 6 feet 4 inches, with the kind of commanding presence that demanded attention. His uniform was perfectly pressed despite the harsh conditions, and his bearing suggested someone who took great pride in traditional military hierarchy. Behind him followed a small group of officers and senior enlisted personnel, all eyeing Marcus with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. "So you're the Pentagon's golden boy," Thompson said, his voice carrying across the small gathering that had formed. "The one who's supposed to revolutionize how we fight these insurgents." He looked Marcus up and down with obvious disdain. "I've got to say, they didn't send us much to work with." Laughter rippled through the group, and Marcus could feel the weight of their collective judgment. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, a veteran with 3 combat tours under her belt, shook her head slowly. "Look, who's here to conquer us," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "They send us a kid who looks like he should be in a library instead of a battlefield and expect us to believe he's going to change everything." Marcus remained silent, his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that responding to such provocations only invited more ridicule. Instead, he focused on observing the dynamics at play. Thompson clearly commanded respect through intimidation and traditional authority. The other soldiers followed his lead, perhaps out of genuine agreement or maybe just to avoid becoming targets themselves. "What's your specialty, Rodriguez?" asked Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the base commander, who had emerged from the command post to witness the new arrival. Unlike the others, his tone was more professional, though Marcus could detect underlying skepticism. "Your file says you're here to test new counterinsurgency methods, but it's pretty light on specifics." "Psychological operations combined with precision targeting, sir," Marcus replied calmly. "The focus is on disrupting enemy networks through strategic pressure points rather than broad sweeps or overwhelming force." This drew more chuckles from the assembled group. Major Patricia Kellerman, the intelligence officer, raised an eyebrow. Sounds like fancy talk for what we've been doing all along, just with fewer resources. How exactly do you plan to succeed where entire battalions have struggled? By thinking differently about the problem, ma'am, Marcus answered. Traditional approaches often treat symptoms rather than causes. The enemy adapts because we're predictable. My job is to be unpredictable while forcing them into predictable responses. Sergeant First Class Daniel Kim, a grizzled veteran with multiple deployments, crossed his arms. Kid, I've been fighting in these mountains for 4 years. You think you're going to come in here with your fancy theories and show us something we haven't tried? These insurgents know every rock, every cave, every local who might help or betray them. They've been doing this longer than you've been in the army. The group's skepticism was palpable, but Marcus had expected this reaction. Every previous assignment had begun the same way. His unconventional methods and slight build made him an easy target for doubt and ridicule. But he'd learned to use that skepticism as fuel, motivation to prove that effectiveness didn't always correlate with appearance or conventional wisdom. I understand your concerns, Sergeant, Marcus said. And you're absolutely right about the enemy's advantages. They know the terrain, they have local support networks, and they've been refining their tactics for years. But they also have patterns, dependencies, and psychological blind spots. My approach focuses on exploiting those vulnerabilities. Captain Thompson stepped closer, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. Listen, Rodriguez, I don't know what kind of desk job you had before this, but out here, real soldiers do real work. We don't have time for psychological experiments or whatever academic nonsense they taught you in officer school. People's lives are on the line. I'm not an officer, sir, Marcus corrected quietly. I'm enlisted, same as most of you, and I've completed 2 previous deployments, both in active combat zones. This seemed to surprise some of the group, though Thompson's expression didn't soften. 2 deployments of what? Sitting in some air-conditioned command post analyzing intelligence reports. Have you ever actually engaged the enemy? Marcus could have listed his combat statistics, the operations he'd been part of, the commendations he'd received. But he knew such responses would only provoke more challenges. Instead, he simply nodded. Yes, sir, I have. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of mortar fire, followed immediately by the base's alarm system. Everyone's demeanor shifted instantly from skeptical banter to professional alertness. Marcus watched as the assembled soldiers transformed into a coordinated team, each moving toward their assigned positions with practiced efficiency. Incoming! Take cover! Someone shouted, though most were already moving before the warning was complete. Marcus found himself temporarily forgotten as the group dispersed to their duties. He made his way to the nearest bunker, where several soldiers were already taking positions and monitoring radio communications. The attack lasted only 10 minutes, but it provided Marcus with valuable intelligence about both the enemy and his new colleagues. He observed how the base's defenders responded, noting their strengths and weaknesses, their communication patterns, and their tactical preferences. More importantly, he began to understand the frustration that had greeted him upon arrival. After the all-clear was sounded, Captain Thompson found Marcus in the bunker. "Welcome to our daily reality, Rodriguez. That's the third attack this week, and we never seem to get ahead of them. They hit us, we respond, they disappear, and tomorrow they do it again from a different position. So tell me, how does your psychological approach deal with that?" Marcus looked around at the other soldiers, all experienced fighters who had clearly been dealing with this pattern for months. Their frustration was understandable, even admirable in its way. They were warriors being asked to fight an enemy that refused to engage in traditional warfare, using tactics that seemed to offer no clear path to victory. "The first step is understanding why they're attacking," Marcus said. "Not just tactically, but psychologically. What do they hope to achieve beyond just inflicting casualties? What message are they trying to send, and to whom?" Staff Sergeant Walsh looked up from checking her equipment. "They're trying to kill us. Pretty simple message." "But why these particular attacks? Why this frequency? Why these targets?" Marcus pressed. "Every action has multiple layers of meaning. The surface level is obvious, but the underlying motivations often reveal more exploitable vulnerabilities." The discussion was cut short by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's arrival. "Rodriguez, I'm assigning you to Captain Thompson's unit for the next week. Consider it an orientation period. You can observe our operations, get familiar with the local situation, and then we'll talk about implementing whatever program you've been sent here to test." Marcus nodded his understanding, but he could see the displeasure on Thompson's face. The captain clearly viewed this assignment as both an insult and a burden. Having to babysit what he perceived as an inexperienced theorist would interfere with his unit's operations and potentially put his soldiers at risk. As the group dispersed, Marcus overheard fragments of conversations that confirmed his assessment of the situation. The soldiers were tired, frustrated, and skeptical of anything that didn't involve direct action against their tormentors. They'd been fighting a grinding war of attrition with an enemy that seemed to hold most of the advantages, and their morale reflected that reality. That evening, Marcus sat alone in the dining facility, reviewing intelligence reports and trying to piece together patterns in the enemy's behavior. The other soldiers gave him a wide berth, their earlier skepticism having evolved into general indifference. He was the new guy, the outsider, the one who thought he could change everything without understanding what they'd already tried. But Marcus had been in this position before, and he knew that perception could be as powerful a weapon as any rifle or grenade. The enemy had spent months studying the base's defenders, learning their routines, their capabilities, their limitations. They thought they understood what they were facing. Soon, Marcus reflected, they would discover how wrong they were. The sound of distant gunfire echoed across the base as night fell, a reminder that somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were planning the next day's attacks. But for the first time in months, those enemies would be facing something they hadn't encountered before. They just didn't know it yet. As Marcus prepared for his first night at Forward Operating Base Thunder, he allowed himself a small smile. The soldiers around him had laughed at his appearance, dismissed his methods, and questioned his competence. Tomorrow, he would begin showing them that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one you never see coming. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the real game was about to begin. Marcus Rodriguez had faced skepticism before, but he'd never failed to prove his worth. This time would be no different, regardless of what anyone thought about the quiet soldier who didn't look like their idea of a warrior. The next morning brought another pre-dawn mortar attack, the third in 4 days. Marcus lay in his bunk listening to the familiar sequence of events, the whistle of incoming rounds, the impact explosions, the base alarm, and the coordinated response of the defenders. He timed each phase, noting the duration and intensity of the barrage. By the time the all-clear sounded, he had formed his first operational hypothesis. Captain Thompson found him in the mess hall an hour later, looking as though he'd barely slept. "Hope you enjoyed your wake-up call, Rodriguez. That's how most of our days start here. The insurgents like to remind us that they're still out there, still in control of the tempo." Marcus looked up from his notebook, where he'd been sketching timing diagrams and attack patterns. "How long have they been using this particular schedule?" "Oh, what do you mean?" "The attacks. They're not random. There's a pattern to the timing, the duration, the targeting. How long has this specific pattern been in place?" Thompson sat down across from him, his expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "They've been hitting us regularly for about 2 months, maybe longer. Why does it matter?" "Because patterns reveal intentions," Marcus replied. "And intentions reveal vulnerabilities. Mind if I join your patrol today?" The question clearly caught Thompson off guard. He'd expected Marcus to spend his time analyzing reports and developing theories, not volunteering for potentially dangerous field operations. "You sure you're ready for that? These aren't training exercises." "I'm sure." 2 hours later, Marcus found himself in the back of an armored vehicle, surrounded by soldiers who made no effort to hide their skepticism about his presence. Staff Sergeant Walsh sat across from him, her rifle positioned casually but ready for immediate use. "Hope you brought more than just that notebook, Rodriguez. The insurgents don't usually stop to discuss psychological theory." Marcus patted the rifle secured beside him. "I brought what I need." The patrol's mission was routine reconnaissance, checking on several small villages that intelligence suggested might be harboring insurgent sympathizers. It was exactly the kind of operation that had been conducted dozens of times before with minimal results, which made it perfect for Marcus's purposes. He wasn't interested in achieving dramatic success on his first outing. He wanted to observe and understand. The first village was typical of the region, a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by small farms and grazing areas. The inhabitants watched the soldiers with expressions of practiced neutrality, neither welcoming nor openly hostile. Children peered around corners while adults went about their daily routines, acting as though the heavily armed patrol was just another part of the landscape. Marcus observed everything: the layout of the buildings, the sight lines between structures, the natural gathering places where people congregated. But more importantly, he watched the interactions between the soldiers and the villagers. Thompson's unit was professional and respectful, but there was an underlying tension that spoke to months of frustration and mutual distrust. "See anything useful?" Sergeant Kim asked as they prepared to move to the next location. "Or are you still developing your psychological profile?" "I'm seeing a lot," Marcus replied truthfully, "but probably not what you'd expect." The second village yielded similar observations, but it was at the third location that Marcus noticed something significant. As their convoy approached the settlement, he spotted several young men quickly dispersing from what had appeared to be a casual gathering. The movement was subtle, practiced, and would have been easy to miss if he hadn't been specifically looking for such behavioral cues. "Stop the vehicle," Marcus said quietly to the driver. "What's wrong?" Thompson asked, immediately alert. "Nothing wrong, but I need to check something." Marcus climbed out and walked to a small rise that overlooked the village. From this vantage point, he could see the entire layout and trace the routes the dispersing men had taken. After several minutes of careful observation, he returned to the vehicle with a satisfied expression. "Well," Thompson demanded. "Communications hub," Marcus said simply. "This village is where they coordinate information about our patrol routes. That's why the attacks on the base have been so well timed. They're getting real-time intelligence about our movements." Staff Sergeant Walsh looked skeptical. "Based on what? A few guys walking away when they saw us coming." Marcus pulled out his notebook and showed her a diagram he'd been working on during the patrol. Based on the timing patterns of the base attacks, the geographic relationship between these villages and the attack positions, and the behavior I just observed. Those men weren't randomly dispersing. They were moving to specific predetermined positions that would allow them to monitor our patrol without being detected. The conversation was interrupted by a radio call from the base. Another unit had reported possible insurgent activity in a valley about 5 kilometers to the east. Thompson's patrol was being redirected to investigate and provide support if needed. As they changed course, Marcus continued his observations, but now with a specific focus. If his hypothesis was correct, their change in direction would be communicated to insurgent forces, and they might encounter prepared positions or coordinated resistance. The next few hours would provide the first test of his analytical approach. The valley was a natural corridor between two ridgelines, the kind of terrain that offered excellent opportunities for ambush. As they approached the reported location, Marcus noted several features that confirmed his growing suspicions. The attack positions were too well prepared, too perfectly situated to be the result of hasty planning. Someone had been feeding the insurgents detailed information about coalition movements for weeks or even months. "This is a setup," Marcus said quietly to Thompson as they dismounted from their vehicles. "What kind of setup?" "The kind where they know exactly where we are, where we're going, and how we'll respond to contact. We need to change the plan." Thompson looked around at the terrain, his experienced eye picking up on the same tactical concerns that Marcus had identified. "What do you suggest?" It was the first time anyone had asked Marcus for his professional opinion since his arrival, and he could sense the subtle shift in the group's dynamic. They were still skeptical, but they were also starting to pay attention. "We approach from an unexpected direction and establish overwatch positions that force them to expose themselves if they want to engage us. Then we wait for them to make the first move and reveal their actual strength and positions." The modification to their standard tactics was subtle but significant. Instead of proceeding directly toward the reported insurgent position along the most obvious route, they would circle around and establish surveillance from multiple concealed locations. It would take longer and require more coordination, but it would also provide better intelligence and reduce their vulnerability to ambush. As they moved into position, Marcus found himself paired with Specialist Robert Chen, a young soldier who seemed less influenced by the group's general skepticism. "You really think this will work?" Chen asked as they established their observation post. "I think it will give us information we haven't had before," Marcus replied. "And right now, information is more valuable than contact." For the next 2 hours, they watched and waited. The insurgents were clearly in the area, but they seemed confused by the patrol's unexpected approach and positioning. Several times, Marcus spotted movement that suggested their opponents were trying to reposition themselves to engage what they thought would be a conventional advance. Each movement revealed a little more about their numbers, their weapons, and their tactical preferences. Finally, apparently frustrated by the coalition forces' refusal to follow their expected script, a small group of insurgents opened fire from a concealed position. But instead of the devastating ambush they had planned, they found themselves exposed to coordinated return fire from multiple directions. The engagement was brief and one-sided, resulting in several enemy casualties and the capture of valuable intelligence materials. As they prepared to return to base, Thompson approached Marcus with an expression that was notably different from their earlier interactions. "That was good work, Rodriguez. How did you know they'd be positioned like that?" Because they've been successful using these tactics for months, Marcus explained. Success breeds predictability. They expected us to behave the way we always have, so they prepared for that scenario. When we changed our approach, they had to improvise, and improvisation reveals capabilities and limitations. The return journey was markedly different from their earlier patrol. The soldiers who had dismissed Marcus that morning were now asking questions about his methods and observations. Word of the successful engagement had already reached the base via radio, and Marcus could sense that his reputation was beginning to shift. But he also knew that one small success wouldn't be enough to change entrenched attitudes or prove the effectiveness of his overall approach. The real test would come in the following days and weeks as he began to implement more comprehensive psychological operations designed to disrupt the insurgent network's effectiveness. That evening, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called Marcus to his office for a debriefing. Captain Thompson speaks very highly of today's operation, says you identified an ambush setup and helped his unit avoid casualties while inflicting significant damage on the enemy. That's impressive work for your first day. Thank you, sir. But it's just the beginning. What we accomplished today was tactical-level disruption. The real opportunities are at the operational and strategic levels. Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with renewed interest. Explain. Marcus pulled out his notebook and began outlining his observations from the day's patrol and his analysis of the broader insurgent campaign. They've been operating under the assumption that they understand us better than we understand them. Our movements, our tactics, our decision-making processes. They've built their entire operational approach around exploiting our predictability. And you think you can change that? I think I can use their assumptions against them. They've invested months in learning to counter our standard approaches. If we change those approaches in coordinated, systematic ways, their entire intelligence network becomes a liability instead of an asset. Harrison nodded slowly. How long do you need to test this theory? 2 weeks for the initial phase, Marcus replied. 1 month for comprehensive implementation. You've got it, but Rodriguez, Thompson's unit isn't the only one that's been watching your performance today. Word gets around fast on a base this size. You've bought yourself some credibility, but expectations are going to be higher now. As Marcus left the commander's office, he reflected on the day's events. The morning had begun with familiar skepticism and mockery, but it was ending with cautious respect and genuine interest in his methods. The soldiers who had dismissed him as an inexperienced theorist were beginning to see him as something else entirely. But Marcus knew that first impressions, whether negative or positive, could be misleading. The real measure of his effectiveness wouldn't be determined by a single successful patrol or one tactical victory. It would be determined by his ability to systematically dismantle an insurgent network that had been operating with impunity for months. As he prepared for another night at forward operating base Thunder, Marcus allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. The psychological groundwork had been laid, both with his colleagues and, unknowingly, with his enemies. Now the real work could begin. The third day brought an unexpected development that would test Marcus's theories in ways he hadn't anticipated. Instead of the usual pre-dawn mortar attack, the base experienced complete silence until well after sunrise. The absence of incoming fire created an atmosphere of nervous tension among the defenders, who had grown accustomed to the enemy's predictable harassment schedule. Captain Thompson found Marcus in the intelligence section, where he'd been studying intercepts and surveillance reports since before dawn. "Something's wrong," Thompson announced without preamble. "They've never gone this long without hitting us. Either they're planning something big, or yesterday's patrols spooked them more than we thought." Marcus looked up from the aerial photographs he'd been analyzing. "Or they're adapting, which is exactly what I expected them to do." "What do you mean?" "Think about it from their perspective," Marcus explained, pointing to a map that showed the locations of recent attacks. "For months, they've been following a successful pattern. Regular harassment, predictable government responses, steady psychological pressure on our forces. Yesterday, we broke that pattern and cost them casualties. Now they're trying to figure out what changed." Thompson studied the map, his expression thoughtful. "So what do we do?" "We help them reach the wrong conclusion." Before Thompson could ask for clarification, they were interrupted by Sergeant Kim, who approached with a radio handset and a concerned expression. "Sir, we're getting reports of increased insurgent activity in 3 different sectors. It looks like they might be massing for a coordinated attack." Marcus and Thompson exchanged glances. A coordinated assault would represent a significant escalation from the hit-and-run tactics the insurgents had been employing. It would also provide an opportunity to test Marcus's psychological operations on a larger scale. "What kind of activity?" Marcus asked. Kim consulted his notes. "Movement of personnel and equipment, establishment of new observation posts, and increased communications traffic. Our listening posts are picking up more radio chatter than we've heard in weeks. Languages and encryption patterns." The question surprised Kim, who clearly hadn't expected such technical specificity. "Mostly Pashto and Dari, with some Arabic. Encryption is minimal, which is unusual. Normally, they're much more careful about communications security." Marcus nodded, his expression growing more confident. "They want us to intercept those communications. They're deliberately using low-security channels because they want us to know about their preparations." "Why would they do that?" Thompson asked. "Because they're trying to force us back into predictable response patterns. They'll mass forces, we'll respond with a conventional operation, and they'll have regained the initiative by making us react to their timeline instead of our own." The conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's arrival. "Gentlemen, I need both of you in the command post immediately. We're receiving intelligence that suggests the insurgents are planning a major offensive against the base and several nearby positions. I want your assessment of the threat and your recommendations for our response." As they walked to the command post, Marcus could see the base coming alive with defensive preparations. Soldiers were reinforcing positions, checking weapons and ammunition, and establishing additional communication links. The atmosphere was tense but professional, the kind of controlled urgency that came from experience with combat operations. In the command post, a large-scale map dominated one wall, marked with colored pins and overlays showing enemy positions, coalition forces, and terrain features. Intelligence officers were updating the display in real time as new reports arrived from various sources. Major Kellerman briefed them on the latest developments. "We're seeing unprecedented coordination among insurgent groups that normally operate independently," she explained. "At least 3 separate cells appear to be working together, with a combined force estimated between 50 and 70 fighters. They've positioned themselves to attack the base from multiple directions, while simultaneously hitting our supply convoys and forward outposts." Harrison turned to Thompson. "Your unit performed well yesterday. I want you to lead the reaction force if they follow through on these preparations. Rodriguez, I want your assessment of their psychological objectives and any recommendations for disrupting their plans." Marcus studied the intelligence display, noting the locations and timing of the reported insurgent activities. After several minutes of analysis, he turned back to the assembled officers with an expression that surprised them. "Sir, I recommend we do nothing." The statement drew stunned silence from everyone in the room. Finally, Harrison found his voice. "Explain." "They're not preparing for a real attack," Marcus said calmly. "They're preparing for a demonstration. This entire operation is designed to restore their psychological advantage by forcing us into a defensive posture. If we respond conventionally, we validate their tactical approach and give them exactly what they're looking for." Major Kellerman shook her head. "The intelligence is solid. We have visual confirmation of personnel and weapons movements. This isn't some elaborate deception." "I'm not saying the movements aren't real," Marcus replied. "I'm saying their purpose isn't what we think it is. They've committed significant resources to this operation, but look at the positioning. They're not optimally placed for an actual assault on the base. They're positioned for maximum visibility by our surveillance assets." He moved to the map and began pointing out specific locations. "Here, here, and here. These positions offer excellent observation of our defensive preparations, but poor attack routes to our critical facilities. They want us to see them, want us to respond, want us to commit forces to counter operations that will expose our own tactical preferences and capabilities." Thompson was beginning to follow Marcus's reasoning. So what happens if we don't respond? They'll be forced to either launch an ineffective attack from suboptimal positions or abandon the operation without achieving their psychological objectives. Either outcome serves our interests better than a conventional response. Harrison considered this assessment for several long moments. The recommendation went against every standard tactical doctrine, but yesterday's success had earned Marcus enough credibility to warrant serious consideration. What if you're wrong? What if this is a genuine attack preparation and we leave ourselves exposed? Then we respond to actual contact instead of presumed intentions, Marcus replied. We maintain our defensive positions, keep our reaction forces ready, but we don't deploy them preemptively. We force them to reveal their true capabilities instead of showing them ours. The debate continued for another hour, with various officers raising concerns and objections to Marcus's unconventional approach. But as more intelligence reports arrived, patterns began to emerge that supported his assessment. The insurgent communications were indeed unusually unsecured. Their positions were suboptimal for actual assault, and their timeline seemed designed more for psychological impact than tactical effectiveness. Finally, Harrison made his decision. We'll try it your way, Rodriguez, but I want continuous monitoring of the situation, and our reaction forces will be ready to deploy at the first sign that your assessment is wrong. Over the next 12 hours, the base remained in a state of heightened alertness, while the insurgent forces maintained their positions around the perimeter. Radio intercepts continued to suggest preparations for an imminent attack, but as Marcus had predicted, the actual assault never materialized. Instead, the insurgent forces began showing signs of confusion and frustration as their demonstration failed to provoke the expected response. By evening, surveillance assets reported that the insurgent groups were beginning to withdraw from their positions. Some fighters appeared to be arguing among themselves, and their previously coordinated movements were becoming increasingly disorganized. The psychological operation had failed to achieve its intended effect. Staff Sergeant Walsh found Marcus in the dining facility that evening, her expression a mixture of amazement and grudging respect. I've got to admit, Rodriguez, I didn't think your approach would work, but those insurgents are retreating without firing a shot. How did you know they wouldn't attack? Because they never intended to attack, Marcus explained. They intended to make us think they would attack, then exploit our predictable response. When we didn't respond predictably, their entire operation became pointless. So what happens now? Now they have to reconsider everything they thought they knew about us. And while they're doing that, we can take some initiatives of our own. The next morning brought confirmation that Marcus's assessment had been correct. Intelligence reports indicated that the insurgent groups were experiencing internal conflicts about their failed operation. Some fighters were questioning their leadership's tactical decisions, while others were beginning to doubt the effectiveness of their intelligence network. Captain Thompson approached Marcus with an expression of genuine respect. "I owe you an apology, Rodriguez. When you first arrived, I thought you were just another Pentagon theorist who didn't understand real combat. But what you've accomplished in 3 days has given us more tactical advantage than we've had in months." "Thank you, sir. But this is still just the beginning. What we've done so far is defensive, disrupting their operations and forcing them to question their assumptions. The next phase is offensive, actively shaping their decision-making processes to our advantage." "What do you have in mind?" Marcus pulled out his ever-present notebook and showed Thompson a detailed operational plan he'd been developing. "We're going to convince them that their intelligence network has been compromised, that their communications are being monitored, and that their leadership has been infiltrated. By the time we're finished, they won't be able to trust any of their information sources or coordinate any significant operations." Thompson studied the plan with growing appreciation for its sophistication. "This is psychological warfare at a level I've never seen before. How long will it take to implement?" 2 weeks for the foundation, another 2 weeks for full effectiveness. But we should start seeing results within the first few days. As Marcus prepared for the next phase of his operation, he reflected on how dramatically the situation had changed since his arrival. The soldiers who had mocked him as an ineffective theorist were now seeking his advice and following his recommendations. The insurgents who had operated with impunity for months were now questioning their basic assumptions and struggling to maintain operational effectiveness. But Marcus knew that success could be as dangerous as failure if it led to overconfidence or complacency. The real test of his psychological operations would come when the insurgents adapted to his methods and began developing countermeasures. The war of minds was just beginning, and victory would go to whichever side could outthink and outadapt the other. The quiet soldier who didn't look like anyone's idea of a warrior was proving that appearances could be deceiving in more ways than one. And his enemies were about to learn that lesson in ways they never expected. The 4th morning brought the first signs that Marcus's psychological operations were beginning to take effect. Instead of their usual coordinated harassment, the insurgent forces launched 3 separate, poorly coordinated attacks that seemed to work at cross purposes with each other. The mortar fire came from different positions than previous attacks, suggesting either a change in leadership or a breakdown in their standard procedures. Marcus observed the enemy's confusion from the base's command post, where he'd been invited to provide real-time analysis of insurgent behavior. Major Kellerman monitored radio intercepts while he tracked the timing and coordination patterns of the incoming fire. "They're not talking to each other," Marcus noted as he studied the communication intercepts. "Normally, these attacks involve precise timing between different firing positions. Today, they're stepping on each other's operations." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison joined them as the all-clear sounded. "Explain what you're seeing." "Breakdown in command and control," Marcus replied, pointing to his timeline analysis. "Group A started their mortar attack at 5:47. Group B opened fire at 5:51, but from a position that interfered with Group A's fields of fire. Group C waited until 6:03 to begin their attack, by which time our counter-battery fire had already forced the other groups to displace." "So they're losing coordination. Why?" "Because they're starting to distrust their communication channels and question their intelligence sources. Yesterday's failed demonstration convinced them that something has changed, but they don't know what. Now they're operating more independently because they're not sure they can trust coordinated operations." The analysis was interrupted by Sergeant Kim, who approached with a radio handset and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Sir, you need to hear this. We just intercepted an argument between two insurgent commanders about yesterday's operation. They're blaming each other for the failure and questioning whether their intelligence network has been compromised." Marcus and Harrison exchanged glances. The psychological pressure was working even faster than Marcus had anticipated. "What exactly are they saying?" Kim consulted his notes. "One commander is accusing the other of providing bad intelligence about our response patterns. The second commander is claiming that their communications have been infiltrated, and that's why the operation failed. They're both questioning whether they can trust their usual information sources." "Perfect," Marcus said quietly. "Now we accelerate the process." "How?" Marcus pulled out a detailed operational plan he'd been refining since his arrival. "We feed them contradictory information through multiple channels, each piece designed to confirm their worst suspicions about their security. We make them paranoid about their own network." The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but sophisticated in its execution. Over the next several days, Marcus would orchestrate a series of carefully crafted intelligence operations designed to convince the insurgents that their communications were compromised, their positions were known, and their leadership had been infiltrated by coalition intelligence assets. The first phase involved leaving false intelligence documents where insurgent sympathizers would find them. These documents, written in perfect Pashto and formatted to look like authentic coalition intelligence reports, contained detailed information about insurgent operations that could only have come from someone with inside access to their planning. Captain Thompson volunteered his unit for the operation to plant the documents. "I've got to admit, Rodriguez, this is the most creative approach to psychological warfare I've ever seen. But what if they figure out the documents are fake?" "They won't," Marcus replied confidently, "because the information in them is mostly accurate. I'm using real intelligence about their past operations, combined with plausible projections about their future plans. The only false information concerns their security breaches, and that's designed to confirm what they're already starting to suspect. The document placement went flawlessly. Thompson's patrol conducted what appeared to be a routine sweep of several villages, during which they accidentally dropped several folders in locations where insurgent sympathizers would inevitably find them. By evening, surveillance assets were reporting increased communication activity among insurgent groups as word of the discovered documents spread through their network. The second phase began the following day with a series of precisely timed demonstrations designed to convince the insurgents that their communications were being monitored in real time. Marcus coordinated with the base's electronic warfare specialists to jam insurgent radio frequencies at specific moments that would suggest coalition forces were responding to intercepted communications. Staff Sergeant Walsh participated in one of these demonstrations, leading a patrol that changed direction immediately after insurgent radio traffic discussed their movement. "It's like we're reading their minds," she reported afterward. "They're starting to act like they expect us to know their every move before they make it." "Because they're beginning to believe we do," Marcus explained. "Each successful prediction of their activities reinforces their suspicion that their communications are compromised. Soon they'll stop trusting radio communications entirely, which will severely limit their coordination capabilities." The psychological pressure